Australia's most prolific, controversial and successful talkback radio host, Alan Jones. He's a colleague here at Sky News and a long-time colleague of mine at 2GB and 4BC. So tonight could be very interesting because he's the one being asked the questions.
Very definite when you go on air.
It's Alan Jones' show. They expect Alan Jones' view.
It tends to be fashionable in this day and age to have a hit at the union movement, and I have to say I've been guilty of that in the past.
Well, good morning. It's 22 and a half minutes to 6, and yes, I am here.
Well, the tables have really turned tonight. The man who asks the tough questions on television right here and for 35 years on radio has to answer them tonight. He's a media monolith in this country. His views have changed governments, impacted policy and influenced lives. But he's attracted an army of detractors as well who go well and truly out of their way to try and bring him down. Thankfully, he's withstood all of that and has agreed to appear on the program tonight. Alan Jones, thank you very much for coming in.
That's a good intro, isn't it? Thank you.
And I wrote it, you didn't write it. I want to make that clear.
Oh, good. That's good.
I want to talk about what we've gone through in the last couple of months in this country. We have heard so much about climate change. We've heard so much about the shame that we should somehow feel over English settlement. The hateful rants against a Conservative Prime Minister. Who's winning, do you think, the culture wars? Do you think the left are bullying their way to some kind of dominance in this country?
Well, I think that's what they seek to do, but I'm very confident that the public, it's a bit like Britain, isn't it? Under Brexit, all the elites and the Harvard-educated and Oxford-educated people were trying to tell the electorate what they should do and they must stay in Europe and so on. But I think the public went over that. They saw above all of that, and it was a comprehensive victory for the non-elites. And I think here, if you look, I think the key poll, and you're absolutely right about the bushfires, I mean, the nonsense. You try and start a fire without fuel, hello? You've got no hope. I mean, these fires were set because we've abandoned cleaning the floor of these forest national parks. I mean, America have 61 national parks. We've got 800 in New South Wales, and none of them are managed. So they tried to argue, and Chris Kenny, who appears on this channel, I think has done some brilliant work with The Australian, and he did some homework and found that climate change in relation to the bushfires was mentioned 900,000 times in 2 months, and that unprecedented, everything was unprecedented, was mentioned 200,000 times. The damage that this has done to Australia is quite significant because around the world they think that this is terrible, this has never happened before, and we're on fire, when it's only 11 years ago that 173 people were killed in Victoria. And in 1851, you had this Black Thursday. 1851, they hadn't heard of climate change and so on. Now, in spite of this saturation of the climate change argument, there was a poll, and you'd think if that were true, people would rethink and think, well, I used to vote for those mongrel Liberals and they've done nothing, and anyway, Labor are no better and I'll vote for the Greens. You know, they're the climate change people and they're the architects of change that we need, the Zali Steggles of this world, who's done absolutely nothing. However, they had a poll then on February 1, a news poll, in the middle of all of this, and the figures for the Greens were exactly the same as they were for last October. So that people are awake up to all of this and they can see beyond it. The only thing is they often feel as they don't have a voice, but I think that you'll find a very profound disenchantment out there with this nonsense, and that's why the climate change apologists and the prophets of doom in relation to the world ending as if 0.04% of the atmosphere could affect anything. But I think you find as those people suddenly feel that they're not getting the traction they want, they become more extreme and more alarmist than ever before. I mean, for example, Flannery, who was made the Australian of the Year in 2007, told us it'd never rain again. I mean, Brisbane would be out of water. If we didn't have desalination plants everywhere, there'd be no water. Well, have a look what's happening in England, have a look what's happening in here. These people have been utterly discredited. And so, no, I think it is a culture war, because if you look at all this stuff, as you write about Anzac Day and about Australia Day and so on.
And we're told even this week that we should not commemorate the 250th anniversary of Captain Cook landing here.
Well, I don't give those people too much oxygen, because out there people just think they're a joke. I mean, not singing the national anthem, the NRL, there's a couple of people who don't want to sing the anthem. That's fine. They're free not to sing. Play the anthem for the ones who do want to sing. You know, I spoke at a dinner the other night, about 400 people. And we had all sorts of... I spoke and then they answered questions and asked questions. And at the end, they said, oh, one more question. And one person said, oh, look, if you were advising the major political parties, what would be the most important piece of advice you'd give? And I said, well, that's the easiest question I've had all night. The simple answer is stand up to minorities. they are minorities. Now, in a democracy that we're in time, I'm not begrudging them their view, but the view is not representative of many people. And we've got to be confident about that out there. The rank and file, the battler, the people on Struggle Street, too smart for all of that.
However, I want to segue to your nephews, and you follow their education very, very closely. Do you despair at how much of this rubbish that they cop and my children cop in the classroom?
They do. It's propaganda, wall-to-wall propaganda. I mean, I made the point earlier this week that it's the anniversary of the bombing of Darwin. And how many kids would have been taught that in school? But they'd be taught about, you know, welcome to country and climate change is destroying the world. And it does worry them. You're quite right. There's that alarmist stuff. There's a young fellow who works for me who is at university, at Sydney University, and I hadn't heard from him. This is last year. He'd done a subject, so I texted him and I said, "How did you go?" Oh, he said, "Sorry, I didn't text. I'm just having a shower because I feel really dirty about what I've written." But he had to write all this left-wing crap to pass the exam. And then a friend of mine who has a grandson at a very significant private school here in Sydney, and the grandson, a dear little boy, and he said, "Oh, Pa, you know, will you come to, we've got a grandparents' day." And the grandfather had gone to the same school as the little fella. So I thought, this is good, this didn't happen when I was there. So he arrived and they met the teacher and there were tea and biscuits. He thought, this is terribly civilised. Lovely way of doing it. So right at the end of it, the little fella said, "Oh, Pa, would you like to come and see my classroom?" "That'd be lovely," he said. So away he went, and there, wall to wall, was climate change. Private school, climate change. So sensibly, the grandfather said, "Oh, what's this about?" "Oh, Pa, this is, you know," and he started to explain how the world was going to end and whatever. So he said, "Oh, I think you need to listen to Pa a bit. We'll have to talk about this stuff." But you see, this is what leads people to be frightened and to be worried, because they think we are betraying them. We're leaving a world that really is going to end and they'll be victims in all of this. And it's very, very difficult. Now, that's where you require national leadership, and national leadership should step into the ring and say, this won't happen under my watch. I mean, Mark Latham is doing a magnificent job in all of this, but there aren't many of them who've got the guts to stand up and say it.
You're one of them. You do it both on radio, television and at public events. But they come after you, and probably in the last 18 months, they've come after you more fiercely than they ever have. Does it get you down, or does it motivate you to get up and go harder?
Well, it certainly doesn't get me down, that's for sure. I mean, you know, we've been round this track many times before, and I think they want to feel as though they can silence you and tell lies about you and say terrible things about you. But my lesson to people is to say you've given two ears, and the reason you're given two is you let it go in one and out the other. You've got to be confident about. I mean, we all make mistakes, and I've made mistakes in the past, and I should be criticised for those mistakes. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, I think you've got to be confident that you're doing the right thing by people, and I think eventually we're winning that battle. I mean, I try to present things, Chris, as you know, quite simply, and I'm simply saying that if it is carbon dioxide that they're concerned about, and it seems to be coal-fired power and all the rest of it, OK, I'll accept that. It's carbon dioxide. Well, carbon dioxide is 0.04% of the atmosphere. So if I were to say, here we are in this massive television studio, and there's a mark on 0.04% of this couch, get rid of it. Now, human beings are only responsible for 5, 6, 7. That figure does vary, but it's no more than 10% of the 0.04%. Yeah. And then little old Australia down here is responsible for 1.3 of the 5% of the 0.04%. If your maths are any good, you're getting decimal 0.0000. You'd have to be an intellectual cripple to believe this argument had any validity. And the public are beginning to understand that. They think, well, we're being lied to about all of this. And now, of course, we've got both parties talking about net zero carbon dioxide emissions. Now, if you want net zero carbon dioxide emissions, you're going to have to get rid of coal-fired power and gas and oil. Forget that. But that's only 32% of these emissions. I mean, agriculture is 14%, transport 16%, so no planes in the sky. And a Cambridge professor said this week, well, if you want net zero, you have to stop aviation.
Yep.
I mean, where the hell are we? These are economic suicide notes, and someone has to stand up to them. You'd like to think your elected representatives would. Trump is. He just laughs at them. Yeah. And look where Trump is. I mean, he goes to a rally in New Hampshire and they can't fit them in.
I want to play a clip of you from last year, late last year, on the subject of drought, which dominated certainly your landscape. Your news and current affairs landscape was dominated by drought. You ran the flag for so many farmers around the country who were doing it tough. I just want to play for you a very emotional part of that presentation from late last year.
Well, the Prime Minister today on radio with me has disappointed millions of Australians. I begged him to provide fodder, water and freight so that farmers wouldn't have to send their breeding stock to slaughter. He just didn't understand. 10 minutes later, William, from up near Gunnedah, a farmer, rang in and started to cry. His family had been in farming for 70 years. He was sending 90 breeders to the sale yard in Gunnedah today. And to you, Mary, and I know that's not your name, we will fight because I have been exactly where the people of Burke are. My old man would be ashamed of me if I didn't fight. I can't speak for Canberra. Take a break.
What specifically made you that emotional? I've never seen you that way. Well,
you see, I mean, I don't need lectures from people about what drought does. I've been there, I've been through it, and I've seen what it did to... I mean, for example, the other day I had Joe Hockey on, and I wrote to Joe because it was wonderful and congratulate him on what he'd done over there. And I remember Joe coming on into the studio in my... because we all have this... I think the older you get, to have a deeper appreciation of the sacrifices your parents made and so on. And Joe started to talk to me about the era of high interest rates, over 20%. And his father was a small shopkeeper and basically was trying to tell me that his father went under, like everybody else, and Joe started to cry. Because you think where you are today, and then you think what your parents endured. And my parents died never having had a holiday. And we would be in drought, and...
So that was as much about what was going on in Australia at the time as it was about what you remember of your own childhood, 5 of you on that dairy farm.
Well, it's worse today because people are taking their lives. Now, in those days, you didn't do that. You just fronted up. You had to be stoic. And I remember the night that my father, at the end of the table, sat at the end of the table and said he was leaving, or words to that effect, and I thought, God, they must have had an argument. I'd never... And this disconcerts you, but it was because there was no money here, so he went to work down a mine. And he shoveled coal with water up to his waist. They went down the pit, 3 miles down the pit. And I would be sent out as a kid. The cow would have a calf, and you couldn't feed the calf. And I would take the little calf down at the end of the paddock, and you put the calf down, so to speak. I won't explain how you did it. Put the calf down. So and this is happening now. And my concern about the bushfires, because we've all fought this case for the bushfires and relief, the drought people have been forgotten. This is going on now. And there are people who say, I'm going down the paddock back, because the women are tougher than the men, and they're going down the paddock to fix the fences, and they don't come back. And all those thoughts, I think, echo through your head at the time, and you're trying to say things that make sense, but this stuff's invading you because it never leaves you, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Never leaves you. It's with you forever.
Did you ever think during that childhood that you'd end up in a Prime Minister's office?
Oh, no, never, no. But my mother always encouraged us to go for broke, so to speak. You know, we went to boarding school because we had no money, but if I didn't go to boarding school, we didn't go to school because there were no schools where we were. But those days, as you know, Chris, the bank manager was a person, you knew him, and they knew Charlie Jones would pay his bills. So they gave Charlie Jones the money to educate his kids, for which I'm grateful. My father had no education at all. And so my mother said, well, when you go in there, they'll ask you to do things. Always say yes and ask what it is later. And so every time they ask, I put my hand up, you know, thinking I'm doing the right thing. And then you just I say to people, make today the best day of your life and the rest of it will look after itself. So it's funny how, I mean, coaching Australia, I never believed that would happen, but fortunately my father survived to see all that success. But
was that year, that 1984 year, one of the greatest years of your life?
Well, it's a very good question, because I think it was most probably 1983 when I was given this Manly job to coach, and they hadn't won a premiership for 39 years, and everyone said it couldn't happen. Randwick was star-studded, and we won that premiership. And I think of all those, that was most probably you're thinking, hang on, is this really happening? We've gone from, you know, from the bottom of the birdcage to the top of the tree. So I don't ever think of things as being the best. I'm very grateful for the fact that on any given occasion you're achieving something and you hope that you're making a contribution to others as well. I'm not much good at self-analysis. That's for others to do. I just try and get on with it. But I think that if you can, in some way, make a contribution to others, that's most probably more significant than indulging yourself.
But there you were in 2017, coaching again, probably the oldest coach that's ever coached any kind of football code in the country.
Yes.
On the record books, that would be what it would show. The oldest coach ever, and you almost knocked off Australia when you coached the Barbarians.
Yes, that's right. Don't show any pictures of that. I had the walking stick. I was the only coach ever with cancer, who had cancer, who was coaching a side. And, yes.
Great challenge.
Bloody oath we did. And the reason, now I can say to you, the reason they beat us, they got 15 penalties to 3 against. They sent off my captain and another player were in front, and they scored on the bell to beat us.